further ado, I'm sure he's a familiar figure to most of you. Introduce Dave.
Thanks for coming out, and thanks to the Hartford Historical Society for the thoughtful work that it does. I was asked to reflect on growing up in White River, and it's a work in process. My brother-in-law, who passed away this past year, and I regaled with a ribald drinking song that ended with the phrase, "I did, but I don't anymore." When he passed, before he went, we all agreed that's what should be on his gravestone. And then we reflected on my nature as maybe optimistic, and so my epitaph is going to be "straight on till morning." This is a snapshot of 10 years from age 2 to age 12. I don't have much to say about age 2 and 3, but as you can see, it starts right in with a good stride at age 4. This is intended to be impressionistic, which means a lot of seemingly inconsequential little dots, bits, comments, and whatnot that at the end hopefully add up to what it might have been like. And I'm sure that almost every one of you here will say, I could have said that same thing. So it's nothing new, it just happens to be my collection. So if you can stand that, maybe we'll have a good night. I've termed it the hood, the hill, and the hole. And as we go through the process, hopefully you'll come to know why I chose that. Obviously it starts off with the hood, the neighborhood. And the other two features, you'll come to realize why I did that. It was a happy time, 10 years of good happy time. And here's how I got my start. I've been over about that. My dad returned from World War II as a seagoing Marine. Born in White River Junction, but really raised in Thetford, where he met my mother, and he convinced her to come back to White River Junction with them and start a life. And she was finished up World War II years at the VA hospital here in White River, waiting for him. This is socializing about the time I was born. They were in or headed to the upslope. Is that right, Mom?
Yes. Where else?
And the first business venture, other than some false starts, was the Briggs & Phillips Esso station, which existed across from what today is called Newberry Market, and on the site of a park that's named for my dad, for what he did in his years, Fred Briggs Park. This little Esso station sat right there, and he and Elwyn Phillips ran it. And I haven't totally researched this, but if you look closely, you see the fellow changing the oil or checking the oil in that car. Pretty sure that's my dad's. And then off to the right, if you look carefully at that van, it says Vermont Cut Flower Exchange. Remember, that was a prominent business initially in downtown, not out on Route 5, where many of you may remember it. And so the first couple of years were spent in a tenement, which if it was there today, would be on the site. Is it better with the lights off? Because I'm not
Good to see you.
yeah, I can see it fine. Thanks.
That's ideal.
Spent 2 years in a tenement at the corner of Barnes Avenue and Maple Street, and if it was there today, it would be right on top of Mascoma Bank. Right there. And eventually the American dream started to play out. This house was purchased pre-911 days at 69.5 Maple Street. Not 69.5, but 69.5. Just to orient you to some of the comments and images you may see going forward, this house sits back from the street, and that's why it was called 69.5. Just past Cascadneck Avenue. And directly behind the house, you can sense there's a little bit of a saddle between two hillsides. The hill that we're going to talk about is off to the left, And the hill off to the right leads up to Garland Row and up the top of Cascade Neck where the Freitas lived and the McKittys. Gary's here tonight. Yeah. So just to orient you to that. You can't take a picture of this house this way today. It's totally forested. It's just totally smothered with greenery. So I want to talk about the neighbors. If you came out the front door of that house that you just saw, you'd be looking at the backside of Chet Fogg's house. And who was Chet Fogg? Well, like I said, a lot of these things are just my memories, my impressions, so add them all up at the end with what I say, maybe you can kind of get an impression of your own. Chet Fogg was a locomotive engineer working in the yard, so that's a pretty important job, and he was clever. I think he owned several pieces of real estate, and he sold my folks that house that you just saw. And he was even enterprising enough to make sure he didn't sell all his land. He put his garage off to the other side. And this is an old garage today, but I remember the day that the lumber truck came in and dropped the boards there, and we were all pretty fascinated with it as kids. You can see our house is right behind it. Chet Fogg left me with a number of memories, but the most indelible one is reaching down out of the cab of a steam locomotive and pulling me up into it. I was probably this tall. And giving me a quarter. Well, we used to scrounge for bottles for 2 cents each, and if you got to a dime, you were in pretty good shape. So to be given a quarter would be sort of like a $20 bill. You have to put it all in perspective. The road off Maple Street came in past Mrs. Williams' house and came down this driveway and parked out and came out on Cascadneck Avenue. And Mrs. Williams was a character. She entered every contest that ever came along, and she won about 30% of them. Her kids were older. Her youngest child was Dwayne Williams, and some of you may have remembered him as an educator. There's the house again. Now, Dwayne Williams became a babysitter for my sister Diane and I, and we teased him incessantly with nicknames. His most endearing nickname was Dooley. When we were mad at him, we called him Mr. Grundy. And when he left for college, we had the vaguest sense of what that meant as little kids. And my mother said, Dooley has saved up his pennies and he's going off to college. And I captured this image that stays with me today. I saw the trunk of the car open with the trunk going in, and I thought, that trunk is full of pennies. You know, kids are like sponges. And they pick it up in a wonderful way. It stays with them too, so be careful. Today, this house is lived in by Bev Pippin. No, Bev made it here tonight. She's only the third owner, or second owner, since we were there. We left in 1958. On Cascadneck Avenue lived a very wonderful couple whose house backed up to us, and their name was Domi. And Eugene Domi was a teacher and then an educator, a principal of the elementary school. And I found out from one person who he flunked that he wasn't really popular. But he was really nice to us kids, and he had a wonderful garden that was sort of the proverbial Mr. McGregor's garden. And his wife was significant, not just because she was so lovely. She was the first person that I ever knew that died. So that leaves you with a really big impact. You could walk right into her house without knocking and sit on the kitchen floor and put puzzles together. And you could make that trip from my house to hers across the back garden, like right through there, unescorted at age 4 or 5. I'm not saying my mother didn't care about me. That's just the way it was. Very cool. They were very proud of their one child, a son, who had been a standout athlete at Hartford and then gone on to West Point and was killed at the end of World War II. A freak accident, not in combat, and an an aircraft crash, and very sad thing. This is the same view, and these scans didn't come out real good, but we talked about global warming and all that. The New Year's Day, 1956, we played a touch football game in back of the Clifford House down Maple Street. There wasn't a flake of snow on the ground. It was one of those dry years until this horrendous blizzard came. And the picture on the left is my sister Betsy, who's here tonight, with some skis that definitely aren't hers. And then the three of us, Diane and myself and Betsy, sitting on this horrendous pile of snow that it took to get Mr. Domi's yard shoveled out. And I brought this out because it's the only time in grade school years I can remember us missing school for the weather. One time, the only time. March 22nd, 1956, according to the picture. Okay, so that's a little bit about the near-in neighbors that we backed up to. There's many others. But one of the impacts of growing up in this neighborhood was the older kids, because they made such an impression, and a good one, too. Talk about this. If you go down Hazen Street off Cascade Neck, headed back towards White River Elementary, it makes a nice little wicked S-turn.
You can slide
see
on that rock.
You can see, yeah, that's
A
right.
lot of years of fans on that rock.
So a nice little S-turn. Why is that significant? Well, this house on the corner, not the one you see, but the one off to the right, was owned by the Palmerine family. And Steve Palmerine was a year younger. He's Steve of Steve's Mobile, you may recall, up on the hill.
Yeah.
And I was a year older than he was, and his brother Bob was the next one. And he was just enough older that he really made a big impact, and he could get us to do things. And I can't go around this S-term without recalling the day that Bob taught me how to ride around this S-turn, standing on the seat of my bicycle without holding onto the handle. Pretty smart thing to do with an S-turn, right?
Yeah.
Who's coming, right? Thanks, Bob. We turned out to be athletes together on the track team. And Bob has had a tough life. Superlative athlete who had a terrific car crash that landed him in the Ottaquechee River 1 year out of high school and left him paralyzed. He's an architectural draftsman in Burlington today. He had an older brother named Pete. Pete rode a Vespa motorbike, and I thought he was a pretty cool guy. And I think Pete lives in Kansas now. The two sisters, Kay and Ann, were impressive because they were in the Hartford High marching band. So was Pete. And the band made a very big impression because it operated out of what is now White River Elementary School, then the high school. The highway that goes up the hill today was just not there. It was Barnes Avenue, a little sleepy street. The highway that really went up the hill went around by Stearns.
Right.
So the Hartford High marching band, practicing in the spring, like nights like now, or earlier, or in the fall, would march up Hazen Street, down Cascade Neck Avenue, turn around and march back. Well, tell me that doesn't light up the fuses of a kid, you know? And I think post-World War II, the concept of a marching band was even more emphatic than it is today. The local Legion had a crack drum and bugle corps, and my dad was in that in the color guard. But it left very positive memories. In fact, probably a little overly positive for me because I ended up going to Norwich University where I was in a marching band and we had a parade every week. The Palmerines. Now, just upstream from that was a little dead-end street that wound up onto a terrace above that rock that you saw. And if you kept going straight, you could go right up through the woods and get to the new elementary school, which was called the Hartford Memorial School. Later on, it got filled in for all the apartments that are up there, but that was our unofficial way to get to school. So a lot of important things happened in the gully. Philosophical discussions and whatnot. And in the spring, it was a torrent. When the runoff occurred, it was dangerous and it was thrilling. Now, next door to the street going up to the gully was a house full of other older kids. The Stackos were really impressive. They were considerably older. I think Harry and Jerry, the twins, were Hartford class of '54, so they were 10 years older. And you have to go back to about the time of the Sacco twins to find a Hartford basketball team that was dominant. And they were so dominant that their games were on WTSL. And when my folks would get a night out, they would leave me home with Harry and Jerry's younger brother, Juju, to babysit me and listen to the ball game on the radio and have popcorn. It was that kind, no TV. But to listen to the Sacco twins play was something else. I want to back up one more time. On Hazen Street, across the street from the Sacco house, was another family that was impressive. And those weren't girls, they were boys, Ray and Freddie Crofts. And they were also in the Hartford band. I think Freddie played the tuba. Like tuba players. And they had a younger sister, but the two brothers were in that band, and so they were impressive. Lost touch, but the father, Floyd, worked for the Tip Top Bakery. And he was memorable because he drove what was called the sound car. Does anybody know what a sound car is? It was an automobile that had big speakers on the front, with a microphone in, and they could drive around town giving some promotional messages. And, nobody knows what happened to the sound car. You know, this was a really happy neighborhood, and yet it wasn't all cool. Freddie Crofts went to UVM and was killed in a freight elevator accident as a student. Now, if you back up to Cascadineck and Maple Street, this intersection looks so different because Maple Street lost all its maples a long time ago and we never put them back. But this house on the corner is memorable, the one that you're looking at with the turret, because a family from the east end of this street moved into it, and it was the Kelton family. This is where Charlie Kelton raised his kids. And his daughter Leslie was a classmate, and son Al was a year or so older. And that was a prominent place for us to play games and make plans for the future. Going up Cascadineck Avenue, you would come to the base of a hill. The hill shot up very steep. And at the top of the hill were a couple of older kids there, the Woodard kids. Georgie Woodard was maybe a good 10 years older than me, and he had a hot rod. And one of the warnings that my mother gave me and all of us kids was to stay off that street when Georgie Woodard was on it. Because it didn't have front-wheel drive, for one thing, and he wasn't going to not make it up that hill. He was a wild man, a little bit of a Jimmy Dean kind of character. His sister Barbara was notable because she had a horse. And she would once in a while bring her horse down that hill and give us all rides on it. She was maybe 6 years older, something like that, just enough to make a big difference. And she was doubly memorable because she and a woman named Sandy Geyer were standout athletes on the Hartford softball team. And the softball field in those days was in what is now the parking lot of the White River Food Co-op. Backed up to Citizens Bank was a bandstand and home plate. Bandstand was the backstop, it was there. And that's where the Hartford girls played softball. And Sandy Geyer and Barbara Woodard could drive a ball to the front door of Hartford High School. I never could do that. It was really easy, I think, I have to say this, years later when the whole women's lib movement came along, to accept that women could do some pretty darn good stuff. And people like Barbara Woodard and Sandy Geyer helped make that a lot easier. This is the other side of Cascade Avenue, and this house doesn't look nearly as inviting today because it's missing its porch. It was a duplex. But the family that lived on the far end, on the right, his name was Mahady. And Frank Mahady was 8 years older. And he made a big impression because he was very vivacious, always out in the street throwing the football, and we could watch him go through his antics. Smart as they come, went to Dartmouth College, went on to Georgetown Law School, where his roommate was Patrick Leahy. And in this Hartford yearbook, you know how they put your ambition, what you want to be when you grow up? He put President of the United States. Well, he came this close to being on the Vermont Supreme Court. And some political enemies beat him back from that. But he's so impressive as a judge that if you go to Middlebury today, the Addison County Courthouse is named, I think, Frank Mahady Courthouse.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. So those are the kind of people that were influencing us on the street at that time. Now, this is a special chapter. This kind of underlines what's possible between age 4 and 10. We have a little bit of an imagination and a willing accomplice named Bill. And just to make sure I get this right, Bill is here tonight. He's the guy in those poster pictures that you saw. Did you see the posters?
Oh, yes, yes, they fly.
Bill, you want to stand up so people can see? Now, the good-looking one on the right is Bill. Life in this part of the neighborhood was pretty exceptional because we were close to town and it was otherwise urban and small lots, but there was all kinds of unaccounted for land, gardens and hillsides and woods and everything else, and we made the best use of it. Here's another picture. This is age 4. Now this is titled The Shack, because if you proceed across that garden that you see there, to the left of the one building you can sense with the 2 windows, was an abandoned chicken coop that we adopted, Bill and I. We were the captains of the shack. And it was a place where we could go and, you know, make public policy. Things of that nature. And if the kids in the neighborhood are older, they're kind to you. And if they're just close enough in age, they can raise a little hell with you. So if you look on top of the hill, you see that nice house there? That's where John Freitas lived. Now, John is a very fine fellow, but he was put together with another kid from down on Maple Street, up a few doors from us, by the name of George Hathorn. And the 2 of them were a little bit caustic. And Bill and I, on one occasion, went to the shack having robbed my mother's pantry of a box of Sugar Jet cereal. And we were out there mowing down when the door swung open and in comes George Hathorn and he says, "Oh, what do we got here?" It was almost like he wanted to get paid off, right? And John was a big burly football player kind of guy. And so the short of it is we gave up the Sugar Jet. Don't you think George and I have a lot of fun together socially today. We're good friends. He was one of the visionaries of the White River scene. He was the Dartmouth College architect for 30 years. A graduate of Yale. Don't you think that every time I see George Hathorn, I don't remind him of the Sugar Jets? I called him 3 times to get him here tonight to defend himself, but he's not here, so. That's the pathway to the shack today. Just get an idea of how it's different. Just all grown in. Now that greenery you see there was a wonderful garden. And before we finish tonight, I'll tell you the magic that happened in that garden later on. Cascadneck Avenue and Hazen Street, the intersection. If you look down the street here on the right, there's a apartment house with 3 units in it. That's where the Crofts lived. And the last unit down on the right is where Bill lived. They heated their house with coal. On the unit to the far end, closest to you, is where Bob and Sally Mock lived, and that's where Beth grew up. Today, Beth is Beth Hill, and she's the recently retired town clerk down at Hartford. I'll tell you one story that my sister Diane and I played a prank on her. When my mother was expecting Betsy, who's here tonight, Betsy hadn't arrived, but Beth was aware of the fact that this was coming along. So we took a doll and put it in a baby carriage, and pushed it down the street, and told Beth that we had our new sister. Bill, do you have any idea at all why this picture's in the deck?
No?
See the street light there?
Oh, yeah.
Well, the street lights in the day were those tin plates with a nice little bulb down, just a sitting duck. Right? And at the
I got one down 7 Hazen Street, yeah.
right here. Well, it's just high enough so you really, at our age, could hardly make the throw. But we were going to die trying. I know that I never did it, but I happen to know that Bill did. This was the backyard of the place where Bill lived. And some of the things that we put together with kids, I have to give our parents a lot of credit, because I don't know that we could have thought this up all by ourselves. Because in those days we were still playing in the sandbox. But on one occasion, Bill's dad was a railroad man, yard master, and he would get us cool things, like kerosene lanterns and flares. Somehow we heard about the story of the last days of Pompeii. And we created a volcano in that sandbox. And his dad brought home a flare. We put the flare in it and squashed it all around perfect and let it off, and we had our own little volcano in the backyard. Then we had this notion, having visited Jim Clifford's house up the street, that he had a whole bunch of black and white cartoons that could be played on a 16mm projector. And so on one occasion, with the help of Bill's mother, we put a sheet against the house and showed outdoor movies to the kids in the neighborhood. And served popcorn, and I think we sold popcorn and whatnot, and came back with something ungodly like $3. And I say this because we weren't that old. We weren't even 10 years old when we were doing this stuff. So we were pretty imaginative and free to roam all the way around the neighborhood at will, which was a pretty wonderful thing. The hill, we'll come back to that. I want to make sure I got all these other antics. Burning the hillsides. The Hartford Fire Department would burn those hillsides as a preemptive strike a couple of times a year. And it was pretty thrilling because they'd come and set them on fire. And then they'd chase the fire up the hill with their water tanks and all that. And we got to see the whole thing. Well, it was fun to emulate that. And on one occasion, this fire that we managed to set right outside the kitchen door of the house, my house, I'm not saying that it was Bill's fault. It probably wasn't in this case. But we got scared about it getting out of hand, so I ran into the kitchen where my mother was ironing to grab a glass of water to put it out. And after I made that trip about 3 times in a hurry, she caught on and ran out the door with a mop pail and threw it out. But we had that hillside pretty much lit up. If this was California, that wouldn't be a joke. I think I hit them. Oh no, there's one other. Up the street from us, you could get there 2 different ways, is the cemetery. And the old section of the cemetery is way down on the street. In the upper section, you have to cross up the hill past the Freitas house and cross what they call Shanty Hill and out into the cemetery. So if we were getting out of range a little bit, we would end up in the cemetery. And on one occasion, we discovered that the custodian had thrown all the flowers from a season down over the bank. And when they sent them down over the bank, along with them went these plastic water picks. And there was a jillion of them. Well, somehow we found out by talking to the people down at Vermont Cut Flower, down on the corner where today is Morris Brothers Mountain Bikes, that they would pay for those. So we got 625 of them. Brought them in, threw them into my mother's bathtub, and got all the weeds and stuff out and took them back to Vermont Cut Flower Exchange and made them mint. $6. So it's those kind of things that just went on and on and on. Because Gary McKinney's here, I'll go off script a little bit and tell you one occasion we had. We were very avid skiers. Off the little slope down at the bottom of the hill, we learned how to ski on our own with some pretty primitive equipment. But on one of these forays up out of the neighborhood, up on by the Freitas house again in Shanty Hill, we crawled out of the woods one day to find these absolute crazoids. I had built a jump on the top of Shanty Hill, and they were going off it and just having a great time. And they were grown men. Gary's father, John McKinney, and John O'Neill. And the jump was pretty good. They were getting about 40 feet off it. And that was a big scale item for us because we had just about reached the point where we could go down a simple slope without falling down. So that was another positive impression. So the hill. Well, to the left of the house that I've been talking about was this unusual feature, and of course it's still there. I don't know how the glacier ever treated us to that, but it was like the perfect amenity for kids. The hill doesn't look very tall here, but you'll see another picture in a minute that will change your mind a little bit. It stands about 75 feet high. I crawled up there the other day just to see if I could still do it. And it was a forest. It was a place where Bill's father would bring us lanterns. My father was in the Army surplus business, would bring us hatchets, purposely dull. We dreamed about the day when we would actually ever fell a tree. Get bored and distracted before you could ever get through the tree. But we spent a lot of time on the hill, camped out there, made breakfast in the morning, and off the slope to your right was just right for skiing, but for the forest. So we hacked out a straight line path, and we put our own jump in it. And if you pushed off the top, we were getting a little bit more capable at this point. If you pushed off the top with the kicker that we had halfway down, you could fly off into space and land on the bottom. And we got 35 feet out of that. And those lanterns would come out so that we could ski after dark in the winter. It was just so much fun to be outdoors. With the lanterns on the kicker of the jump so you knew when to take off. You pushed off in the dark, headed for the beam of light, and then cast out into the dark. And, well, this was all well before we were 12 years old. So, we were getting more and more capable on the skis. The hill was just a fabulous amenity. This is what it looked like from the top. You can see the house down there. And on the back side was the rock. Now we spent a lot of time hanging out on this rock, and this, I couldn't find the fracture in the rock as I recalled it, but we were absolutely convinced that that fracture in the rock was really something that could be rolled back, and that inside would be untold wealth. We fantasized for hours about what was inside that inside. It must have been millions, the rock. And now we come to the hole. This is the last antic of our years there. I think we were coming up on 12 years old. And down in the saddle at the bottom where the ski jumpers would land, one day after school, we just casually started digging a hole. Do you remember, Bill, why we were digging?
Yes,
To bury a cat or something?
we were trying to trap somebody who owed us some comic books.
Oh, in the house where John Clerkin's offices are today, lived a contemporary, a year or so younger, named Larry Larrabee. And Larry apparently had gotten under our skin. So we were going to dig a hole, put leaves over it, just like in the funny books, and Larry was going to fall down in the hole. Well, the soil there was the perfect sandy silt, sort of auburn-colored, beautiful sand, and it was so easy to dig that we forgot all about the trap and we kept digging. And pretty soon, a nice hole about the size of the top of this table was down deep enough so that we couldn't throw the dirt up anymore. And by that time, 3 or 4 other kids in the neighborhood had gotten wind of this project. And so we ran and got a bucket and a rope, and we started digging more and sending the dirt up on the rope. By supper time, it was 12 feet deep. This is where it gets scary when I think about it in retrospect. It was the perfect soil condition to not necessarily cave in, except for just before we went for dinner, we said, we could build a room down here. So we started tunneling out. And it was time for dinner. My mother called, and that was the end of that day. But flash forward years later, I'm a civil engineering student at Norwich and learning about soil mechanics. And I'm thinking, oh my God, that could have sheared off, and there wouldn't have been any reception or funeral services necessary. Put a flower. But the next afternoon, Larry Larrabee's mother had figured out what we were doing. She didn't know why. She'll never know why, because we'll never know it. But she called my mother and said, those kids are doing something dangerous. I want that hole filled in. And as the project manager, I got home late from school that day, and the hole was already half filled in. My contemporaries were following orders. I said, what are you doing? Well, it's a good thing they did. Thank you, Mom. But the hole stands out as one of those crowning engineering achievements of our whole youth, because I told you we never could chop down a tree and finish anything, right? But we did a number on the hole. And anytime I see Alfred Kelton, he was the elder in this case. He just can't get this story out of his mind. It was the coolest thing we ever did. Now, there were a few things, and I'll finish up here, of off-the-block experiences, where we went off that Hazen Street, Cascade Neck complex and down the street. And one of them was to a marketplace that was right at Barnes Avenue, where today the Mascoma Bank is. And it was Renault's grocery store. And they had 2 boys in their family that are our age. Roger was a couple of years older, and Rick was my age. And they lived above the store. It was a wooden building that had a fantastic basement in it if you're a little kid. And again, we were doing all this stuff unsupervised, just going any place. And the parents were working in the market. They didn't care as long as we were just tumbling around. Well, it was a fantastic basement to be in. I think the lost Ark of the New Covenant. It's just so fun to play there. But off in one corner, Marcel Renault had his own little desk and a calendar on the wall. And this was a memorable moment because the calendar was something like a Playboy calendar. And as like a 7 or 8-year-old, I went down and I stumbled into that and I said, wow, look at that. I'll never forget that. A little bit of that's good for you. On the corner where Citizens Bank is, was originally the Lyman Homestead historic house that was torn down, I'm going to guess somewhere in the 30s. And a teacher that we all had as our first grade teacher was Miss Scully, and she made quite an impact because she was, in retrospect, a preservationist. She lamented the fact that the Smith chocolate factory had been torn down and the Lyman house had been torn down. And obviously it made an impact on me because I've been a lifelong preservationist myself. But anyway, it was replaced by a modern, for the day, gas station made out of brick. It was a Gulf station. And in our day, it was owned and operated by Leonard Timmons. Very hard-working guy, full of energy, very enthusiastic guy. And this story is another close call. I was riding my bike down the street, approaching that intersection, which, by the way, still had no lights. It was the intersection of Route 4 and Route 5, which would be the equivalent in the time of 89 and 91. It had no lights. And a woman had pulled up to get gas, and someone hadn't been watching, and the gas had filled up, didn't shut off, and it was running all over the ground. And Leonard Timmons was inside, and he looked at it, horrified, and he ran out to get it, to fix it. And I saw this all happen right in front of me. And he was ever so diligent. He ran out and got it. But the thing that stuck in my mind was, all the time he was doing it, he had a cigarette in his mouth. See, kids don't forget stuff. I said, oh my God. Okay, the last chapter here of stories is called Overstreet. Anybody want to guess why?
Over the bridge.
We never said we're going downtown. We never said we're going into the village. From our neighborhood, we said we're going Overstreet. So that was an easy place for me to relate to because my dad had the gas station and eventually, sooner than later, the clothing store, which, by the way, started in the basement of what you may recall as Fonda's dress shop. If you come through the underpass and look hard to your right, there's a window there. And believe it or not, for a year or so, two families made their livelihood out of a little store there, selling Army surplus and Boy Scout items. Had my first job there to make enough money to earn a Boy Scout knife. And on one occasion, my father had apparently said, come to the store after school. We had moved from the municipal building as first graders up to the new school in the middle of our first grade year. So I walked down the hill over the bridge, and as I came over the bridge, I thought, how am I going to get to my father's store? I better make a decision now. So I crossed in front of what was then the fire station and walked through the underpass on the wrong side, no sidewalks, in a day when there was a lot of traffic to get there. Another example of what kids do, you know, they're trying to do the right thing and they put themselves in pretty serious danger. My father sent me all over the village in those years to do errands like change at the bank or supplies at White River Paper, which was where Vermont Salvage is today, and any number of errands, which were a good thing because responsibility, had to pay attention, and all of the people, and not all men either, typically were known to me by their first names. It wasn't a disrespectful thing, it was just we're all in this together. And whether you're going to White River Paper Company or the bank or whatever, you were relating to all of these people on your own. That led to the influence of both my father and Ellen Phillips with his sons, Dale and Scott, to see if we could make a little money on the side. And the usual format would be lemonade stand, right? But we're in an urban situation. So we went to Shining Shoes. And they had shoe shine kits in the store, which they gave us the polish and all of that. And we sat out on the street, three little boys, saying, shine sir, people getting off the train, whatever. And this dapper guy comes down the street, and you can tell that he's sympathetic. He's going to give us some business. So he pulls up to the shoe shine box. He's got nice looking slacks and pretty shiny black shoes, actually. I don't know why he needed the shine, except he was gonna give us some business. And when he pulled up his trousers, he had bright yellow socks on. And he said, "Don't get any polish on those socks." Before we were done, he had racing stripes. One other thing, you recall that the traffic used to go the other way? That's another story I'll tell you another time, about how that got reversed later on in 1980. But once the store had arrived at its final destination, which is where Revolution is today, there's a loading dock off the back. And the cars would come up through the underpass and straight through, right? Perfect for snowballs. Because they're pounding and going straight ahead, they're focused, they're on a mission, right? And if you timed it just right and the snowball hit the side window, by the time they realized that they'd been had, they were down the street too far and had no idea. Those are pretty harmless things, don't you think? So, this group had absolutely nothing on us. And so, I want to end with one final story. My folks made it possible for me to get involved musically by buying me a cornet in 4th grade. And I took to it, and I still play. And I usually play for family events, usually in church where people have been trained to forgive. But it's been a joyful thing. And one of the families that we connected with, my mother with their mother, was the Terrio family. And Teddy Terrio was the operator of Teddy's Grill in the Terrio block. The building that's now on the corner across from Revolution was previously a 3 or 4 story building, and it burned down in 1948. And the next generation, World War II generation, Teddy Terrio and his brother Norman, rebuilt it as a 1-story building that we all remember. And Norman had the malt shop and Teddy had the bar and grill, and it was a classic. And in the basement, Teddy's wife Ruth had what she called the Rathskeller. Well, I think she was too busy having kids and raising them to really ever make that into a business, but it was there. And their second oldest child was a boy named Kerwin. And Kerwin was younger than me, but he actually had a lot more moxie. And he said, you play the horn? I said, oh yeah, I do. It's just like these guys, right? He said, we're going to put on a show. He said, well, what's the act? He said, you are. So he said, go back up the street and get your horn. They lived in the house that's still there next to Kibbe Equipment. And next door to that was where their grandmother had Teddy's Sports Center, which is a really prosperous business. Terrio kids were a riot. So Kerwin is my agent. I said, well, where are we going to have the show? He says, my dad's restaurant. So on the show day, we went through the bar and grill. And this is a scene in White River in 1956 or so. It would open up at 10 o'clock in the morning, maybe earlier, and people would be sitting at the bar having a drink because they might have worked all night at the Tip Top or on the railroad or whatever, and for them it's Miller time. And rooms filled with smoke, you know, the whole bit. So we went through the bar, down in the basement. Now I'm supposed to practice up my tune. And I don't play by ear, I have to read it off a stand. And the one song that I could play was Carry Me Back to Old Virginia. He had paid entertainment in there, and a guy named Kenny Newton provided the entertainment with an organ. And he was there that morning. So Kerwin went to him and said, Kenny, Dave and I are going to put on a show. Can you back him up? And he said, sure. So they propped me up, I played the tune, the guys at the bar clapped, I looked forward, I can see my dad had been summoned across the street to see the spectacle. But it was that kind of antic that just made being in White River at this point in history a joyful thing. Thank you for listening. Jillian other stories I could tell. If you've got questions, I'm sure Bill has the answer.
Anybody have any questions or comments? Anybody want to add anything?
I was just going to make a comment. Mary Ann and I went through the new assisted living place recently, and there's going to be a pub in that building, and they're naming it Betty's Pub.
Yeah, they
Are you aware of that?
Yeah, reflective of this.
Yeah.
Yeah, they've tried to pull names that are reminiscent of White River's past.
You mentioned the philosophizing of kids. Can you remember what did you think about?
Sure. Bill, you okay with this?
Sure.
Well, this is a really interesting reality of White River Junction. On my mother's side, I'm a 7th generation Vermonter Congregationalist, right? And we ended up in the Methodist Church because, as my mother reported, he was the first minister that came to call, so that's where we joined. But White River Junction was dominated by Irish and Italian people, and so it's heavily Catholic. So I grew up as a minority, really. I say that with tongue in cheek. Bill's real name is Toomey, so he's all Irish. And so we're coming down through the gully one day, and we're talking about all the important things. And somehow it comes up out of him, he says, you know, you're not going to heaven. I went to church, I went to Sunday school, and he said, say that again? So we got into a little bit of a debate about how that could be. But it's really telling, isn't it? Because, you know, you would hear certain things through whatever you're being trained, yeah.
Further to that same conversation, I remember having left catechism or whatever it was called, having to go home and tell my mother, who was a Protestant, that she was going to hell. That didn't go over well.
Every year you mentioned snowballs. I have a story about, I don't know if anybody remembers the St. James family that lived just before the bridge across the municipal building. Their son Robert was in the same grade I was. And he was not much of an athlete, but he was really smart. And he made it this game called Bet You Can't Hit Me. It was the alley, I don't know if I can explain it. It was where the post office was, and now there's an alley right there near the Hotel Coolidge.
Yes. Yeah.
And he would stand at the end on the street, and when he'd see somebody coming by, he'd go, bet you can't hit me. And I'd throw it purposely high, and I'd hit the person behind them. Because I had the good arm, but so he would do that. He'd bet you can't hit me. And one day I'm doing it, and I throw the snowball, a nice guy's hat off. It was Stan Wright, her boss. And he was so mad. That's it. That's the kind of thing.
In the picture behind you, where is Teddy's?
On the left, this isn't very good scan, I'm sorry, but this is Revolution Clothing Store. And then Tucker Box is at the far corner, and you can see if you look closely at the Esso gas station at the corner. The Ontario block we're in here, what is now a 4-story building.
I grew up in Maine. I assure you, in a test, but you're not going to go to heaven.
Yeah, but that's not the reason.
Wide and far. Who's getting in and who's not getting in?
Yeah.
I didn't grow up in White River, but, you know, some of the themes, I grew up in what was a rural town in New Hampshire. It's no longer rural. You know, the idea that, you know, as kids we would go off and do these things, and there was this freedom of activity and we're in a new stage for our children in our communities today. It's not the same. The idea of going off and there's like philosophy points, like the rocks. Well, I lived in a place where there's huge piles of granite rocks. Oh gosh, but we would philosophize whether or not Robert E. Lee made the right decision to stay with Virginia, or should he stay with the Union, or whatever it happened to be that day. It was just, there's a theme here that you can relate, even if it's not White River. It's the idea of childhood that I appreciate it. Yes.
About that whole Catholic thing, there was no kindergarten in town at that time except for the St. Anthony. So I graduated in the class of 52 from St. Anthony's kindergarten. Sister Stanislaus taught me how to play the cornet in the convent.
In my town, because we were so close to the Ameskeet Mills, we had lots and lots of Catholics. In fact, the Catholic Church in town used our elementary school for their catechisms on Sunday, and our school always had fish on Fridays. And I thought there was more Catholics than anything else when I was a little kid, until I brought this up and my dad corrected me and said, no, actually, there's Catholics are a minority. It just happens to be our town. And I was like, because I just thought everybody was Catholic, it seemed like, because there were so many Catholic people in our town. Right, it was just kind of, it was Hooksett.
Oh, Hooksett,
yeah, right from Manchester, right. So, yeah, it's just amazing, right.
Oh, yeah.
And what?
Here's my epilogue.
Oh, okay.
I told you I'd tell you a little bit more about that garden next to the house. My sister Betsy here was born in 53, and somewhere around 55 or 6, when she was capable of getting out into that garden, she went in that direction one day. And there's another story about her getting loose too, I'll tell you. And ran into this little kid that we always said she found him under a cabbage. And it turned out to be Mickey Flanagan. And they were new in town because Peter and his partner Andy had moved to town to buy and operate Hartford Motors. And because of the friendship between Mickey and Betsy, my mother and Mary Ellen, who's here tonight, became best pals across that same garden, and we're still just as close as you can be, two families of surrogate cousins. The other story about Betsy getting loose had to do with on the back porch of that house that you saw tonight. Originally had no porch there at all. It had some really primitive concrete steps. And my father arranged to build a new back door entrance, and he got a guy from Lebanon named Eli Shapiro, great name, to come over with a wrecker and lift that monolithic piece of concrete out from the house, and he hauled it up the driveway towards Mrs. Williams' house and across the street and dumped it into the White River. Ostensibly, right? Well, Betsy was watching this whole process, and sometime later, fascinated by the fact that the steps had gone that way, about this tall, she went off to find those steps. And by the time we caught up to her, realized she was missing. She was halfway down the bank into the White River. I don't know how we ever even thought to look there. But if you do what I do often now with groups in the hotel, float down the White River on inner tubes, you know where to look, you can see those steps. I stop every once in a while.
Testimony to being a real river rat.
Yeah. I just wonder, once you got there, what would you have done? Tried to pick them up?
Who knows?
You weighed as much as Jupiter. So as you can tell, the stories could go on and on, but it's that little impressionistic piece which can resonate with all of us. Really appreciate you giving me the chance to spin these tales.